I want to say, again, thank you all for inviting me. For the organizers, especially for Robert May, who was one of the organizers who reached out for me and asked me to be a keynote speaker this year. I was, as was mentioned, here last year in Orlando, Florida, and I was absolutely amazed by the interactions I had with all the speakers here and the other people, and realized I had a new sense of camaraderie with this community that I had never had with my scientific colleagues before, because it encompassed this new aspect of understanding consciousness from this perspective that I call the first-person perspective, which I feel is so important in addition to looking at it from the scientific perspective. So I'm very thankful to be here. Now, my intention today is to take you along on my journey, which I describe in my book, Infinite Awareness, which you can see on the slide. And it's a story about my being this rigorously trained neuroscientist who has an experience in meditation that puts a crack into my materialist worldview. And then how I began to do research on both meditation and on near-death experience. And through this, I found new windows into the nature and the origin of consciousness. So, telling you a little bit about my background, for those of you who didn't hear me speak last year, here's a little bit about myself. First of all, as you see on the slide, I am a neuroscientist, and I study behavior from what I call the third-person perspective, or the objective perspective, typically. And here's a little bit more about my background. I've written about 150 papers in neuroscience on such things as brain development, aging, and neurologic disease. I've received grants from the National Institutes of Health for from $500,000 to $1 million per grant. And I wrote a textbook for clinicians that's now in its 5th edition, related to assessing and treating patients with neurologic problems. But most importantly, when I started out, I was a scientific materialist. And what this meant is that my scientific view was that our thoughts, our movements, our awareness, or our consciousness are solely a product of neurons in our brain. But then in 1976, I began to meditate. And I had an experience in meditation that opened up for me a dimension of awareness that I had never before experienced. I was invited by my sister to a meditation retreat. And it was to be given by an Indian master of meditation. Now, though I was skeptical, I was curious, and I decided to attend. The first morning of that retreat, it was announced that the meditation master was going to walk around the room and initiate every individual there. The initiation was described as a spiritual awakening, and it was to happen through the Swami's touch. Now, clearly, the scientist in me was skeptical. But I decided I was there, and so I was going to put my skepticism aside for the weekend. And besides, I was curious to see what would happen. So when the Swami reached me, my eyes were closed, but my senses were otherwise fully engaged. I was very aware. So when I felt what seemed like, when he touched me between the bridge, on the bridge of my nose, between my eyes, what felt like an electric current go inside me down into my body, I had a sense of utter certainty about the event. It's not that I knew what was happening. To this day, I can't explain precisely what happened. But it felt like a small lightning bolt went from the Swami's fingers to a point between my eyes and down into the center of my chest. I could feel the exact place where it stopped. It was my heart. Not my physical heart, but more like a heart than my physical heart had ever been. And from my heart, energy began radiating outward, filling my whole being and beyond. It felt like pure nectar, like love flowing through me. Words came to mind, and they had nothing to do with scientific analysis. I'm home. I'm home. My heart is my home. What was most astounding for me about that weekend was what happened afterwards. Without any will or any effort, as soon as I returned home, my habits turned around 180 degrees. The next morning at 5 a.m., I woke up spontaneously and I got up to meditate. I did this day after day after day, and in fact, it's never ceased. I did this knowing that just beneath the surface of my awareness simmered a quiet ecstasy. I tapped it once, and I knew it was there waiting for me. So what you can begin to see from this experience and on the slide is that there was a shift in my worldview, and I had a professional dilemma. Is my world truly Newtonian, or is it energy-based? So I began to explore the nature of consciousness from what I call this first-person perspective, my own awareness, my own subjective experience. And I asked, what is consciousness? Is it tied to neural activity? Or could consciousness exist without neurons? And you see on this other side of the slide, what I'm showing you here is what I call a meditator's view of the body's energy centers. And perhaps some of you who have had near-death experiences might have experienced something like this yourself. So in that first meditation, I experienced energy in my heart radiating out through my entire being. And since then, I've also experienced energy between my eyes and at the crown of my head that is intoxicating. It's full of this feeling of joy and love. So I want to say now that even though I was meditating now every morning, in my early years as a meditator, I considered myself first and foremost a scientist. The scientific part of me had no interest in really finding research support for paranormal phenomena that I considered, for example, very mystical. Such experiences are not within the scope of Newtonian science. And this precise cause and effect material view of the world was still the view that I held. So if somebody mentioned a topic like energy healing, or near-death experience, or even worse, reincarnation, I would raise a cool and skeptical eyebrow, and I would say nothing. Now, this actually created a real fragmented life for me, as you see here. On the one side, I had my experiences of meditation, and I would talk to my friends who meditated about one set of experiences, and when I taught a class in meditation or yoga. And then I would walk into the laboratory and talk to my neuroscientist friends about a whole different set of experiences as I talked from that point of view of a scientist who was a skeptic and materialist. Now, I should say that this dichotomy drove my husband, Paul, who's in the audience, crazy. And that's because we would be going to a dinner party with my friends who were neuroscientists. And my husband, Paul, loves meditation and complementary medicine. And he would start to bring up one of his favorite topics, homeopathy or acupuncture or energy healing, only to get a kick under the table from me, as I would politely help him change the topic because I was so worried about losing my credibility as a neuroscientist with my colleagues. So after 25 years of leading these two lives, I felt a bit schizophrenic. And it was a problem I decided to resolve by publicly integrating these two halves of my life. So as I wrote this book, I was seeking what I would call another level of integrity. I was trying to bring those two worlds together. I wanted to speak frankly and openly about my experiences as a meditator. I wanted to explore these experiences and find out what they have to say about the world we inhabit and the nature of our human mind. The experiences that I and many others, including yourselves, have had may not fit into the view of traditional neuroscience. But if, and I feel certain this is the case, they did happen, then perhaps we need to re-measure the box we call neuroscience. Maybe it's time for that box to expand. So today what we're going to be doing is looking at the nature of subjective experience and at competing theories of human consciousness, and also at scientific studies on both meditation and near-death experiences. And the question of these, at the heart of these seemingly disparate topics is this: Is the consciousness that we actually experience in our mind primary? That is, can it exist independently of the activity of our brain, or whether it's solely a product of our physical brain? Many questions hinge on this one issue. Do I, as a human being, have free will at all? Or are my seeming choices determined at a neural level by the mechanics of my brain? And when my brain dies, do I, as myself, disappear? Am I nothing more than my physical apparatus? And I know that many of you already know at a deep level the answer to these questions, but as you're aware, most scientists do not. So I first began trying to bridge this chasm between these two sides of myself by doing scientific research on meditation. I asked, as you see on the slide, does looking at, in fact, it says here, meditation from this scientific or this third-person perspective inform us about the origins of consciousness? I wanted to understand if meditation actually changes our mental abilities, and if so, how it does this. I wanted to know, what is the physiological basis for those changes? And what I found is that this research shows us that meditators are like athletes of the attentional arena. Basically, their attentional systems become stronger and more flexible with meditation. In fact, our lab and many others have shown that meditation improves our attention and our emotional regulation. We become happier. We have more equanimity. And our EEG studies, and that's me and our laboratory in the EEG cap, have shown that our attentional networks also get stronger. Literally, the structure changes. So what I want to do now is tell you about one study that we did in our own laboratory on attention and meditation. So what we did is we asked, what are the effects of meditation, that's just say Tai Chi, versus aerobic activity on our attentional focus? And what we did here is we actually compared 4 different groups of individuals: people that had been long-term meditators, long-term Tai Chi practitioners, people that had been aerobic walking or jogging for many, many years, and we compared them to sedentary adults. And we were wanting to know whether their attentional systems become more subtle, more efficient when they do meditative practices. So here's what we did. We brought them into the laboratory, and we actually put an EEG cap on their head so that we could measure their brain activity. And we had them look at a computer monitor. And there was a red dot that would appear on that computer monitor randomly on the right or the left side. And they had to respond by pressing a mouse button down below, like you see here, on the left or the right side of that mouse, according to changing rules. For the first 2 trials, when that red light came on, they had to respond with the mouse button on the same side. Then after 2 trials, they had to shift the rule, and when the red light came on, they had to switch to the mouse button on the other side. So this is a very complex thing. You have to remember what trial you're on and which mouse button to press, and you have to go as fast as you can. And here's the secret of what we were actually looking for. When that red light came on, our EEG cap would measure the electrical potential in the brain that tells us how much attention is being given to that red light by the person. So we can measure their attentional abilities, their ability to focus. So what did we find? When we actually looked at what we call the event-related potential, the ERP, of the different groups, and we looked at what we call the grand average of this P3B switch amplitude, we found that when the stimulus comes on right here, about 300 milliseconds afterwards, there was this attentional potential. Notice that the people that are sedentary almost showed no real response. People who are sedentary are not very good at attending. The people who were meditators or practiced Tai Chi showed the largest event-related potential, meaning they were really, really good at concentrating, at focusing. And those people that were aerobic walkers were halfway in between. Now, we chose aerobic walkers here because we know that aerobic activity brings more blood to your brain and helps it. But we're saying meditation and Tai Chi do much more even than that. So the answer is yes, meditation does help our attentional systems, but I wanted to know where in the brain is that change that makes that happen. And so we did one more thing in this study. We did something that's called independent component analysis. And it separates that potential you just saw into all the different sources in the brain that might be contributing to it. And what we found is there was one part of the brain that's colored in yellow here, and it's called the anterior cingulate cortex. And that particular part of the brain is the one that was responsible for these large changes in potential in the meditators and those people that practice Tai Chi compared to the aerobic walkers and the sedentary adults. You might want to then ask, why do we even care about this part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex? And this is why. The size of this anterior cingulate cortex, which is shown right here in a child that's about 4 years of age, is very, very important because it is highly correlated with success in the world in later life for young children. It's the best predictor of how well children resolve conflict. Conflict resolution at 4 years of age is highly correlated with success in later life, including health, income, their personal relationships, and their level of criminality. The most important part is this size of this anterior cingulate cortex is modifiable through meditation. You can actually make it larger, and therefore all of these things get better. So now let's talk about what we've learned about consciousness from this third-person perspective meditation research. So in our lab, basically we've shown that meditation improves our attention. It increases our focus, and it reduces our distractibility. And this is associated with changes in this anterior cingulate cortex and in the frontal lobes of our brain. Now, other labs have shown many other things as well. Meditation reduces our stress. It improves our emotional well-being. We're happier. We have more equanimity in challenging situations. This is associated with changes in our hippocampus and our amygdala in our brain. And also, meditation improves our immune function. We tend to stay much, much healthier than people who don't meditate. But my question really is this all that meditation tells us about consciousness? Meditation experience from the first-person perspective suggests that it does much more than this. So now what I want to do is to discuss some of what we've learned about the effects of meditation from what I call this first-person perspective, our own personal experience. And I'm going to give you an example from meditators' own observations. So what I want to do now is talk to you about meditation and consciousness from the perspective now of David, who is a colleague of mine and who is a neuroscientist. Now, David was a materialist neuroscientist just like myself when he had a spiritual awakening during a meditation retreat. Now, he'd gone to this meditation workshop while he was doing his postdoctoral training in developmental neurobiology. He said he had always been intrigued by the concept of meditation, and he'd even tried it on his own a few times in college, but nothing really had ever come of it. But he said during the first day of this meditation workshop with this Indian meditation master, he went into a meditation that was deeper than anything he had ever experienced before. He said he lost awareness of all external sensation, and he went into this deep state of absorption filled with love and joy, peace and calm. He said after the workshop was over that day in the evening, he began to feel energy rising inside of him, subtly at first, and then more and more powerful. He said he had the sense that something amazing was about to happen. He said that night he was awakened from his sleep with a powerful jolt of energy going up his back from the base of his spine to the crown of his head. And he said then it exploded with a bang and a brilliant flash of beautiful light. He said when he opened his eyes, his awareness was suddenly no longer confined to his physical body. In fact, just like with people with NDEs, he was floating on the top of the room, looking down at everything. He said the next day in the meditation workshop, he learned that he had had a classical experience of what is often called in India Shaktipat initiation, the awakening of this inner energy of meditation, which in fact Bruce Grayson, who we all probably know in IANS, calls the bioenergy that drives human evolution. He said over the next months, as he meditated, this beautiful light began to expand more and more until it filled his entire body. And he said one day in meditation, he was filled with this indescribable ecstasy, as well as floods of love, waves of love coming up inside of him. He said in that moment, he lost awareness of his individuality. He felt like he had entered the heart of God. He said at that moment, he felt more like himself than he had ever felt before. Now that's the first person perspective, but what I want to do now is also say, let's look at this from a neuroscientist point of view as well. And I want you to think about what he said. Basically, what he's telling us is that there really is an energetic component to consciousness that he experienced in that moment. Remember, he said that energy really moved straight up his spine, from the base of his spine to the crown of his head, and it exploded. And then his awareness went beyond his physical body. Neuroscientists do not have a way of explaining that type of consciousness from our normal materialist point of view. This tells us consciousness is much more than that. So what I want to do now is say, is there a way to integrate? In fact, what this should be saying is there a way to integrate these first-person experiences with our own scientific worldview? Can we begin to put these together in terms of one new integrated understanding of reality and consciousness? So one insight that I feel helps explain both of these worlds is something that Sir James Jeans, who was an astronomer, a mathematician, and a physics professor, actually said to his colleagues in quantum physics. He said this. He says, the essential fact is simply that all the pictures which science now draws of nature, and which alone seem capable of according with observational fact, are mathematical pictures. He says they are nothing more than pictures. Fictions, if you like, if by fiction you mean that science is not yet in contact with ultimate reality. Sometimes neuroscientists forget this. And I want to show you, again, looking at the right-hand side of the slide, an example of this. When I was in graduate school and taking my classes in chemistry, we were taught that electrons are basically rotating in shells around the nucleus of the atom, and that when they get more excited, they shift to an outer shell and then they come back down again. That was a mathematical picture that we had at that time. Now we have a slightly new mathematical picture of electrons going around the nucleus, and that is this one down here, where they're literally now seen as being in probability clouds, where we don't really know where they are, somewhere around the nucleus of the atom. So this reminds me that all of us, neuroscientists and yogis alike, are operating under the same constraints that Sir James Jeans was talking about to his quantum physics colleagues. And we have to realize that there isn't actually an ultimate reality that we are seeing in front of us in our textbook pictures of what the world is about. So I want to ask you this question then: could meditators be giving similar accounts? And I want you to think about it. Pictures of meditators' experiences don't necessarily depict ultimate reality, but they do point to something that isn't easily described. It's a little bit like predicting these electron orbits I showed you. Specific observations from their first-person experience, like these we see here, are used to form an image the person who drew that image can then remember. They can understand, and they can communicate to others, and they can say, did you have an experience that looked a little bit like this? So the point is, we can ask, is it real? And I would say, not per se. For meditators, it's this attempt to elucidate an experience of meditative energy and to indicate a reality beyond the picture or the words associated with it. So then we might ask, how does all this help us to understand the nature of consciousness? Next, what I want to do is show you the traditional medical model regarding the nature of consciousness, and also one that's been proposed by more and more scientists interested in meditation, energy healing, and near-death experiences. And here is our model, our two models of what I call the brain-consciousness interface. We have on the left what I call the materialist Newtonian model. And in this model, basically it says that the activity of the neurons in the brain is contributing to, in fact, the sole creator of what we might call our local consciousness or our mind. Now over here, there should be a question mark because neuroscientists to this day do not understand how the activity of neurons in our mind can actually create our mental awareness. This is called the hard problem in neuroscientists. No one knows how it happens. Now here is the other model. Energy matter continuum model is what I call it. And here you have a non-local consciousness that exists that can be filtered down into our local consciousness of our mind, which can also affect the activity of neurons in our brain. And now you see we have arrows going both ways because, yes, the brain can affect our local consciousness and the non-local consciousness, and vice versa. Our non-local consciousness can affect our mind and our brain. So as we continue our discussion today, I want you to think about these two models and see which model the data I'll be showing you actually support. So what we're going to be doing now is to explore consciousness from these first and third person perspectives, looking now at near-death experiences. And we're going to be studying it from both this experiential perspective and from the scientific or this third person objective perspective. And the questions I'm going to be asking are these. Can consciousness remain when the heart and the brain have stopped functioning? And are NDEs real, or are they just hallucinations? I feel that recent studies bringing these two perspectives together, first and third person, in NDE research show evidence that cannot be explained by my original Newtonian model, my worldview. So let me tell you now about one study by Pim van Lommel and his colleagues, but also note to you that, in fact, there have been many other studies that have been done on near-death experiences in addition to Pim van Lommel's, those by Bruce Grayson, those by Parnia and his colleagues, one just done in 2014. So this, first of all, is what we call a prospective study. And from a scientist's perspective, this is the gold standard of studies in this area. And it was, in fact, published in Lancet journal, which is ranked #2 of all the journals in medical science. What they did in this prospective study is they brought in everybody that had a cardiac arrest from a particular date and time throughout about 4 years of time to a network of 10 hospitals in the Netherlands. Then, of all those that came in, 344 patients actually survived and were able to be interviewed afterwards. All of these patients had a flat EEG, meaning they had no surface brain activity. 12% of those had a near-death experience, and 1/4 of them watched and recalled events during their cardiac arrest when they had no brain activity. These people were those, again, watching from above things that were happening in the operating room and in nearby places. Now, this is the conclusion that Pim van Lommel and his colleagues say. They say the thus far assumed but never proven concept that consciousness and memories are localized in the brain should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain is no longer functioning during a period of clinical death with flat EEG? Now that's an understatement because they were talking to the Lancet journal reviewers. But this is clearly letting us know they do not believe in the materialist view of reality from their data. So I want to tell you next about the near-death experience of a woman doctor who had been a confirmed atheist before her NDE and who I interviewed for my book, Infinite Awareness. So Dr. Bettina Peyton was an avowed materialist until she had a near-death experience during the birth of her third child. At the time, she'd been practicing internal medicine for 2 years. Peyton's story begins when the ultrasound from her pregnancy shows that this pregnancy is going to be much more complicated than her previous one had been. A year before, she had been given birth to 2 healthy boys. This year, the ultrasound showed that the placenta was covering the birth canal. And as her pregnancy evolved, and the uterus enlarged, there was going to be a high risk of bleeding. And this would be very life-threatening to both the mother and the child. Now, as expected, bleeding did start in her 7th month of pregnancy. And so she was ordered to strict bed rest on the OB/GYN ward of the hospital. Every night, her doctor, her husband, who was also a doctor, actually came to her bedside on the OB/GYN floor, and her husband brought the 2 twin boys for a bedtime story and a hug and a kiss goodnight. Now finally, in the 8th month of pregnancy, the amniocentesis that they were doing weekly showed that the baby's lungs inside of her were mature enough so that the baby could actually live independently. And so they decided at that point to do a surgical delivery, a C-section. Now, Bettina Peyton knew this was a high-risk procedure, and that's because the placenta was covering the whole front of the uterus. So when the doctor actually made that incision through the front of the uterus, he would be cutting through what is essentially a venous mass of lakes of blood. She said she tried to distract herself as they prepared for the surgery by joking with the surgeon, as the nurse was putting down the surgical drapes and the anesthesiologist was actually injecting the injection drug into her veins. She said she then lost consciousness until she heard a voice. Her blood pressure is too low. She said it was her anesthesiologist's alarmed voice which snapped her awake as if from a deep sleep. He said her blood pressure is plummeting fast. Then she heard an expletive. Shit, there's no blood pressure whatsoever. She said at that point, she noticed a strange stillness spreading inside her chest. She said something was missing, her heartbeat. Her heart had stopped. She said at the same time, her vision opened and she could see into the room. She said, how amazing. They had taped her physical eyelids of her eyes shut to protect the corneas during the operation, but through some other mechanism, she could see everything in the room. She said there were units of blood hanging from an IV pole overhead, and one was already being transfused. She said she realized at that moment that nobody else knew her heart had stopped, and then she heard this volley of strident beeps as the cardiac monitor then registered her lack of a heartbeat. She then saw her anesthesiologist take his fist and slam it into a big red button on the wall. In medical jargon, he was calling a code, which would eventually result in the arrival of the hospital resuscitation team. Now, there's more to the medical drama that was unfolding, but I want to now turn to Bettina Peyton's own experience, her feeling that she was about to die. She said, in my inner vision, in the backmost boundary of my mind, I saw a darkness unfolding. She said, my attention, my awareness reached the edge of the precipice, and I arched back over this chasm of darkness below. She said, very naturally, I leaned back and I let myself fall, gliding in a graceful backward arc into the unknown. She said the darkness was filled with particles of sparkling light. The light shimmered, it actually sparkled. She said in that light, there was this loving presence, an intelligence, a pulsating power. She said, I felt enveloped in peace and love. She said all was perfect until I heard this voice, not really in words, but as a quiet thunder. You must live. She said with that voice, she suddenly saw her awareness spiraling downward through that beautiful darkness until her awareness opened into the confines of the operating room below. At that point, she said the resuscitation team was just bursting through those double doors into the operating room to see their colleague's lifeless body on the table. She said she saw then her surgeon doing what he later called was his first 3-minute hysterectomy, and everyone around her was trying to revive her to get that heart to start again. She said nothing was working, and then the senior surgeon entered the room. She said he was wearing blue scrubs, he had white hair, and he walked through the crowded room to her right side, and without a word, he reached his hand into her blood-filled abdomen. He located the aorta, wrapped his fingers and thumb around it, and then clamped the aorta shut. She said this was the most painful moment of the operation, but she also knew it was the turning point. She was going to live. She said a few moments later, a nurse leaned over and whispered in her ear, she had a new baby girl. Her baby had survived. She said the next moment that she opened her eyes, she was in the recovery room, surrounded by her husband and the team of doctors and nurses. She still had a trachea tube in her throat, and so she couldn't speak, but she motioned with them not to speak and to give her something to write with. She then wrote on a napkin words to this effect: I know I have a baby girl. I know my uterus is out. I know my heart stopped. The entire story and much more detail is in my book, Infinite Awareness, but what I want to point out to you right now is that if this highly cogent and completely accurate account is verified, and I will show you evidence that it is, then we need to have a new scientific framework to take such an experience into account. People in the millions, many of you here have had similar experiences, near-death experiences in meditation, as recipients of energy from healers, and on and on and on. How do we really actually then account for this in a new scientific framework? What I want to do next now is to really talk to you about the evidence now from that third-person perspective about the validity of what Bettina Peyton actually experienced. I want to say that in the next few days and weeks after this happened to her, she had conversations with many of the personnel in the hospital, in the delivery room, and they verified every one of the perceptions that she had under anesthesia with her eyes taped shut. She said, I spoke with the surgeon and the anesthesiologist, and they were both aghast at what I had to say. They said they could not explain it, and they were willing to go on a TV news program on NDEs to actually talk about this in public. They confirmed that everything she perceived could not have happened normally, physiologically. So I'm going to show you now in this next slide, in fact, all of the things, at least 8 of them, and you can't see them all so clearly on the screen, but I will again go through them with you. This is the verified accuracy of her operating room recollections in this Tufts Medical Center before and during her cardiac arrest, again, while she was under anesthesia with her eyes taped shut. So the first is that she heard that anesthesiologist say her blood pressure is too low. That was verified, absolutely. She heard the cardiac monitor registering her lack of a heartbeat, and that was verified. She saw those several units of blood hanging above her head, verified again. I didn't mention it, but she also saw her anesthesiologist hunched over her right arm inspecting the IV line. She saw the anesthesiologist slam his fist into that button in the wall. She saw the surgeon performing her hysterectomy. She saw a catheter inserted in her right jugular vein, and the anesthesiologist trying to insert one in her wrist and then going to her elbow. All that was verified. She then saw that white-haired surgeon enter the room and take his hand into her blood-filled abdomen and locate the aorta. And finally, the nurse whispering in her ear that she had the baby girl. So now I can say from a neuroscientist perspective, I have shown at least 8 different things that she thought were true that were actually verified by all of the medical personnel there. So what I want to do now, though, is talk about the story that Bettina Peyton now tells of her search to reconnect with that experience. And I think that's one of the themes that we want to be talking about a lot in these IANS conferences. How do people with an NDE get back to that experience, that expanded state that they had? So after her NDE, once Bettina Peyton awoke, she was utterly convinced that consciousness is primary. In her words, when I woke up in that intensive care unit, I had vivid recall of everything that had happened. My perception was, and it still is, that I am not this body, not this individual, and that consciousness is the substratum of all that exists. What I find particularly interesting about Bettina Peyton's story is the process that she underwent to get back to that expanded state of consciousness. She said in time, she heard about a local meditation center, and she thought meditation might be a means for getting back to that state that she was in. She went to a program, and she said there was a video of one of the meditation teachers, a woman. And she said when she listened to the video and watched it, she said she kept staring into the woman's eyes. She said, I didn't hear a word she said. I kept looking at her eyes. She said her eyes told me something more than the words. She said, I felt that she knew something. She said, I didn't know even what I needed to know, but I knew that she knew. The look in her eyes told me. She said she found out there was going to be a meditation workshop in 2 weeks. And with great difficulty, she got time off from her 3 babies in diapers and her job to go to that meditation workshop. She said none of her colleagues knew why she was doing this. They thought she was a little crazy, and she said she wondered herself. When she got to the meditation ashram, she was told she could see the meditation teacher the next morning at the ashram chant. She said that morning, when the teacher walked into the chant, Peyton's heart started pounding. She said she kept staring at this woman fixedly. She said she knew it was rude, she knew it was inappropriate, but she couldn't take her eyes off of her. She said when the chant began, she heard this voice inside of her shouting out silently, look at me. And then again, louder, look at me. And finally she said it was like a silent roar, look at me. In that moment, she said the teacher raised her eyes from the chanting book, looked at the crowd, and then slowly shifted her gaze in Peyton's direction. Peyton says she knew the exact moment when their eyes met, even though she was 30 feet away, because in that moment, there was once again this beautiful bridge of sparkling black light between them. She was back in that same near-death experience she had been in before. She said, I merged into her, or she merged into me. We became one. I was experiencing that same state of expanded consciousness. She said, I was in that state, and she knew I was in that state. She was in that state as well, and I now knew I had found my way back. She said then in the next moment she heard these words coming up inside of her from the teacher in the teacher's own voice, which was, welcome home. You have come home. When I heard that, I thought about my own first meditation experience where I heard almost the same words. And I wondered, what does home truly mean to me? And I realized it means the experience of something more authentic and more joyful than anything I had experienced before in my life. What I think is most important about this experience of Bettina Peyton's is that when she reconnected with this expanded state through meditation, it transformed her life and her career. She went into hospice care and was able to actually help the creation of this medical field that eases people's transition to death. She said she was a very good hospice care doctor for 2 reasons. One is that all the things that people were going through in their death experience were identical to those she had experienced in her NDE. They had had the experience of expanded awareness, of actually seeing relatives they had known before that were on the other side, of having wonderful spiritual experiences. And she said, when she walked into a room, her lack of fear could be felt. Everyone knew that she was totally fine and at home with this experience. So what I want to do now is tell you about one other similar experience, but of a 10-year-old boy that led him later on to meditation as well. This is the story of Lee Lyon, who is now living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he was riding home on his bicycle from school when his near-death experience happened. He said as he was riding home, he had to cross a 4-lane highway that was going through town in order to get to his house. And he said just as he got to that highway, the front wheel on his bike jammed, and he went careening over the front wheel. He said in that moment, he saw car grills coming at him at 50 miles an hour. And he says, when you're a 10-year-old, that's pretty striking. He said at that point, he heard this tiny little click, this little pop, and suddenly his awareness was above, it was floating above, and he was watching the scene of the accident unfold. He said his awareness then expanded into this amazing spacious state. He said in this state, he felt incredible pleasure. He said the state felt like this love that was like drenched in this warmth and this ecstasy. He could not believe it. He said, remember, I'm a 10-year-old boy and I am not used to experiencing love like this. He said, then what happened to him is that he began to have these experiences of moments in his life coming before him. And he says, again, I'm only 10 years old, but these are events I didn't even know I had remembered. And he said, it's a little bit like you have a deck of cards and you take your thumb through it and you see one card after another going by. He said there were hundreds of them, but he remembers 2 right now. He said one was being in his neighbor's farm's field of wheat and seeing the golden wheat in the afternoon sun. He said the other was when he came home from school one day and he saw his mother crying, and it really hurt inside of his heart. And he said he wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. She said her father had just died. He said in that moment he felt the caring and the confusion and the preciousness of life of a 10-year-old boy. He said more and more scenes came in front of him. He was inundated with these scenes. And then he saw his body slowly, slowly hitting the pavement. And cars now streaming around that body going 50 miles an hour. He said evidently he landed between lanes because they were able to bypass him. But he said, I'm up in this beautiful state of joy, just watching it happen. He says, then I hear a voice. He says, it's coming from my left side. It says, you need to get back in that body. And he says, how bizarre. He says, I'm in this love-drenched place. I'm totally expanded and happy. There's no way I want to squeeze myself back in that little tiny 10-year-old body. So he ignores the voice. And he says, there's a pause. And then he says, the voice gets stronger and it says, you need to get back in that body. And he says, the voice has gained momentum. And he says, I still think, looking down at that body, feeling where I am, he says, no way. Then he says, suddenly he feels this explosion. He doesn't remember anything else except he's back in that body, his head is on the pavement, and he's looking at these cars going by him at 50 miles an hour. And he says, when you're 10 years old and your head is on the pavement, those hubcaps are giant. It's amazing. He said, then there's a gap in the traffic. The cars stop. And he said he suddenly grabs his bicycle, he drags it across the highway, and then he sits on the edge of the highway, totally stunned, wondering what has happened to him. He said he spends 2 hours sitting there and then slowly walking home, trying to understand what state he is now in, filled with love and ecstasy, and what had happened to him. He said when he got home, he didn't tell a soul. He said that the experience lasted for 2 days, this wonderful feeling of ecstasy and joy, and then it began to fade. And he said when it finally ended, he had 2 things that he remembered forever. The first is that when you die, you will experience everything that was beautiful and meaningful to you. He said that will stay with you and everything else will fall away. He said, secondly, he had to find a way back to that experience of expansion and ecstasy. He said he didn't want to spend the rest of his life back in this contracted state of awareness. And he said, sure enough, when he was 27 years old, 17 years later, he met a master of meditation. And he said in the moment he met that master of meditation, he expanded, bang, back into that expanded state. And he said as he continued to practice meditation, he was able to stay there more and more often. He now teaches meditation full time because he wants to awaken others so that they too can re-experience, whether it was a near-death experience or whether they can experience for the first time, that beautiful expanded state of consciousness. Now, what I want to do right now is to talk to you a little bit about the importance of what these people had had. And I just want to remind you about the fact that you're going to hear Eben Alexander speak in a couple of days at this conference. And as you may know, he had somewhat similar experience after his near-death experience in terms of finding his way back to that expanded state through meditation. And from my perspective, the most important truth that Eben Alexander, Bettina Peyton, and Lee Lyon, and probably many of you have discovered regarding the near-death experience is the understanding that the experience can be replicated in meditation. Alexander says it is not necessary to experience an NDE to provide this knowledge. It can be intentionally cultivated. What is needed to access these truths is that we do the work. We go deep inside our own consciousness through our prayer or our meditation. He says, long-term meditators and mystics have demonstrated this for millennia. It took me, Alexander says, a few years after my coma to understand this, but I finally realized I had to develop a regular pattern of meditation to expand my relationship with the spiritual realm. He says those meditations help me not only to re-access elements of my near-death experience, but to reach deep levels within my own consciousness. So I want to ask, what is the connection between this energetic awakening in meditation and in a near-death experience? I think this unusual link between the NDE and meditation is worth dwelling on. Each of these states of consciousness is actually capable of opening a door to what a meditator would call their true perception. This individual awareness of your unity with that infinite awareness that is all that is. So what I want us to talk about now is how do we put these two together, and are there scientific studies that have actually done this? And in fact, there are. In many Eastern traditions, this energy is called the Kundalini energy, or the ki, or the chi. I imagine many of you have heard some of those terms before. And it's believed to be awakened in meditation, allowing people to perceive and to experience those higher energies, those higher levels of consciousness. Now, Bruce Grayson has done a very interesting study to explore whether NDEs, like meditation, can arouse or awaken this spiritual energy within. Bruce Grayson calls the spiritual energy the bioenergy that drives human evolution. So I'm going to tell you now about a study that he did. In this study, he asked, when he's looking at Kundalini and near-death experiences, can NDEs awaken the spiritual energy within? In doing the study, he used an item called the 19-item Physio Kundalini Index questionnaire that had already been normed for people that have had meditation experiences and awakenings of that energy. And he compared 3 different groups: 150 people that had had an NDE, 55 that were close to death without an NDE, and 113 that had never been close to death. And I'm just giving a few of the items here from this questionnaire so you can see some of what he found. So he first looked at what he called sensory phenomena. He asked, have you ever had a feeling of extreme heat or cold? Because this often happens to people with energy awakenings. Notice over half of the people with an NDE had had this experience, whereas only 27 or 19% of the others had. He asked, had they heard internal sounds like whistling or roaring or flute-like sounds? And again, twice as many with an NDE had had it as the people that had not. Then he looked at seeing internal lights or colors, something we often hear in NDEs. Once again, many, many more people with an NDE had had this than the people who had not. So yes, they look very much like people that have had this spontaneous awakening in meditation. He then looked at motor phenomena, and as a meditator, these sorts of things I know are very common in meditators. He asked, do they have issues where their breath spontaneously stops or becomes rapid or shallow or deep? And again, twice as many people with near-death experiences had this type of experience compared to those who had not. He also asked, what about your body assuming or maintaining unusual positions? And by this, I mean often meditators find that their hands go into what they might call mudras or other positions in meditation. Once again, the people that had had an NDE had 17% of a possibility of this happening compared to those that had not. So what Grayson then concludes is that NDEers are reporting precisely the kind of physiological changes that are associated in Eastern traditions with this bioenergy that drives human evolution. So one thing I might ask then is, what about the mystical aspects of meditation and the NDE experience? Are they also very similar? Well, in fact, if you look at the mystical characteristics of meditators and of people that have had NDEs, they are strikingly similar when you look at the research data. What I have on top is what people often call major aspects of these mystical experiences, and these are things that have been studied by, for example, William James way back in the early 1900s, and also Ed Kelly, Bruce Grayson, and others more recently. What you see here is that they notice in meditation, people feel what they call an ineffability. This means the feeling defies expression in words. They also have a noetic quality. This means they feel they found truths that are unplumbed by our human intellect. This is the same thing that happens when you look at the literature on near-death experiences. There are also many other characteristics you see here that happen to meditators. A feeling of peace, joy, and love that you heard me talk about in mine and others' experiences. A sense of being outside one's body, as David found in his meditation experience. Experiences of light. Experiencing a presence full of love. Experiencing other realms. Spiritual transformation and moral elevation. Increased care for others. Decreased fear of death. And unity awareness. Notice that almost all of these are exactly the same for people who practice, who actually have near-death experiences. So what I want to talk about now is I want to talk about one more clue about the nature of consciousness. And that is that there appear, from talking with people who've had near-death experiences, that there are two independent modes of processing immediately after a person has had a near-death experience. And I want to tell you that I, first of all, really became aware of this when Karen Thomas, in fact, is Karen Thomas in the room today? If you are, raise your hand. Yes, there she is, right in front of me. Emailed me a few weeks ago. We had talked earlier in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, about her near-death experience, and she said, in response to a Facebook post which asked, what did you actually experience or become aware of in that moment that you opened your eyes after a near-death experience, she realized she had two simultaneous modes of awareness going on in that moment. She said the first was her absolutely clear and detailed memory of her near-death experience, totally crystal clear in her brain. But the other was, and I'm talking here, I show you this foggy brain phenomenon, was her disorientation to the environment, while her brain was slowly recovering from, in fact, the anesthesia and all the other trauma that occurred during her operation. She said, for example, when she opened her eyes and she saw these blankets over her distended abdomen and felt a lot of pain, she wondered in that moment if she had come into the hospital to actually have a baby delivered and they had to do it surgically. And then later she realized, no, I came in for an operation to my spinal cord. So that's what we're talking about, this disorientation that can happen when your brain is not processing things very well. But yet, this other level of consciousness that you experienced in your NDE is perfectly clear and precise. So what, in fact, Karen was saying is, my goodness, I really do think I experienced that transcendent consciousness that I was remembering everything through in great detail at the same time as that which was going through my brain that was not fully back online. Now, after I talked with Karen Williams about this, and she also shared this with Robert Mays, I began thinking back to other people's experiences of their NDEs, and I realized that, in fact, once again, Eben Alexander said exactly the same thing in his book. He actually says that what he discovered was that when he woke up, the first words out of his mouth were, "All is well." But then he remembered that he went through what he in fact called a rather paranoid few days of coming back online, in effect, with his brain, where he was having bizarre experiences and not really understanding what was going on. He said, I acted a little bit crazy before I finally had my brain come back online. So I really challenge all of you here in this room to perhaps maybe help me and Robert Mays and others really do research on this in the future, because I think it gives us one more clue about this dual aspect of our awareness. So, in ending, I want to say, what is the nature and the origin of consciousness? Might that higher mode of processing of the NDE that Karen and others have experienced be related to an experience of that expanded consciousness, that non-local consciousness we talked about in our top-down theory of consciousness? Materialist neuroscientists assume it's only the activity of the brain that generates consciousness. But these first and third-person research studies suggest that the brain also may be actually transmissive of this wider consciousness, like an optical lens or a prism. Or it may function like a radio receiver serving this interface function. These are the real questions that I feel still need to be answered. So I won't say any more about these theories today, except to say that I believe our scientific worldview is expanding. And I quote now a neuroscientist, Christoph Koch, who in 2012 actually said a beautiful quote about how his understanding is expanding. He was originally a materialist neuroscientist, and he modified his view to say that he believes that consciousness is distinct from brain activity. So here is his quote that's on the slide. He says, the hypothesis that all matter is sentient to some degree is terribly appealing for its elegance, simplicity, and its logical coherence. Once you assume that consciousness is real and ontologically distinct from its physical substrate, then it is a simple step to conclude that the entire cosmos is suffused with sentience, that it's in the air we breathe, the soil we tread on, and the brain that enables us to think. I believe these are revolutionary statements from one who was a materialist neuroscientist, a Caltech professor, and a research colleague of Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize winner. They mirror my own transformation. Writing this book, Infinite Awareness, has allowed me to bring my own first-person perspective and my third-person research together, and my scientific worldview has thus expanded. So from originally thinking that my experiences were outside of my scientific box has expanded sufficiently to include those experiences within it. And what I hope for Infinite Awareness is that other scientists and people like yourselves who have had NDEs or other experiences and have questions about our prevailing materialist paradigm, whether from your personal experience, your observation, or your plain frustration with a model that doesn't fit all the data, will begin to give these questions airtime and write about them and design projects to look into other possibilities. In this way, science moves forward. Thank you.